She was mopping blood off the floor when the dying man grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron. His eyes were fading fast, but his voice ragged desperate, certain cut through every alarm, every scream, every chaos in that ER. "Medic 7, he rasped. "I know who you are." And with the last strength in his hand, he wrote it on her arm. 2 words, 7 letters, a name she had buried so deep she thought it was dead forever. It wasn't. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. There is a kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with magic. It is earned slowly over years of being looked through instead of looked at, of being the person whose name no one bothers to learn because the job they do is considered beneath acknowledgement. Sarah Jenkins had lived inside that invisibility for 11 years at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, and on most days she preferred it that way. She was the first one in and the last one out. She fixed the things that broke the ventilators, that hiccuped at 3 a.m. the IV pump, that beeped its error code like a lost animal, the defibrillator cart that stuck on its wheel and threw nurses into panic. She also cleaned what no one wanted to touch. The rooms after the worst outcomes. The floors after the worst nights. She did it all without complaint, without drama, and without ever being thanked. The badge on her chest said S. Jenkins Biomed/Environmental Services. Not a nurse, not a doctor, not anyone who mattered according to the hierarchy that hummed underneath St. Jude's like a second electrical system. Sarah was 44 years old, lean, from years of physical work, with gray threading through her dark hair that she never bothered to dye. She wore her scrubs like armor, practical, nondescript, protective. Her eyes were the kind of brown that seemed calm on the surface but held something deeper underneath, something most people never got close enough to notice. She noticed everything. That was the thing nobody understood about Sarah Jenkins. She noticed everything. The night it began, the city was already burning. Not literally, not at first, but the tension that had been building for weeks in the streets had finally fractured, and what started as a protest in the warehouse district had spiraled into something uglier, faster, and more violent than anyone predicted. By 8 o'clock that evening, the police scanner frequencies were screaming. By 8:30, the first ambulances started arriving at St. Jude's in waves. Sarah was in sub-basement 2 when she felt it. Not heard it, felt it. A vibration in the floor that told her the freight elevator was running on overload. She had her toolkit in her hand and the ventilator fan assembly spread across a workbench, and she went still, the way animals go still when the air changes. Too many gurneys rolling at once, she thought. Upstairs is getting hit. She set down her screwdriver. She listened. The ceiling above her told the story in rumbles and footsteps, and the muffled, frantic rhythm of voices that had gone from controlled to urgent. She had heard that particular frequency before, not in a hospital. Somewhere older, louder, and far more dangerous. She picked up her radio. "Dispatch, this is Jenkins in sub 2. What's the status upstairs?" A pause. Then a voice stretched thin with stress. "MCI declared mass casualty incident. All available personnel report to ER level immediately." Sarah clipped the radio to her waistband, looked once at the ventilator she had been repairing, and walked to the door. She was not all available personnel. Nobody would have called her name in that announcement. She was the tech. She was the custodian. She was the woman who fixed the machines and cleaned the floors and disappeared into the background. But her feet were already moving toward the stairwell, and the part of her brain that had been asleep for a very long time was starting to wake up. The ER looked like a battlefield. She stepped through the swinging doors, and her senses processed it all in under 3 seconds the way they always had. The way that had once been trained into her until it became reflex. 12 patients visible, 4 critical by posture alone, 2 nurses visibly overwhelmed, 1 physician, Dr. Anand Kapoor, a solid ER attending triaging with steady hands, but too few of them. 3 gurneys backed up waiting for assessment. A man in Bay 4 was breathing wrong, and nobody had looked at him in the last 40 seconds. She knew that last detail because she counted. Jenkins, charge nurse Diane Hollis, spotted her first. Diane was a 20-year veteran with a voice like a foghorn in the face of someone who had seen everything and was currently seeing more than she'd planned for tonight. "What are you doing up here?" "Your biomed. Your EKG monitor in base 6 is throwing false readings." Sarah said, already moving. The electrode lead connection's loose. Someone's going to misread a rhythm off that machine. Diane stared at her for half a second. Fine, fix it and get out. We're swamped. Bay 4, Sarah said quietly, not stopping. That man hasn't taken a full breath in over a minute. Diane's head swung toward Bay 4. The man there, mid-50s, dressed like someone who had been caught in the street chaos, a gash across his scalp matting his gray hair. Dark was sitting upright on the gurney, his chest moving in that shallow, rapid pattern that looked like breathing, but wasn't. Not adequately. Kapoor, Diane's foghorn voice cut across the noise. Bay 4 now. Sarah was already at the EKG machine in Bay 6, her fingers moving on the electrode connector with the practiced efficiency of someone who had repaired it twice before and knew exactly which pin was intermittent. 12 seconds. The false artifact disappeared from the screen. She straightened up. Bay 4 was being assessed now. She didn't look back. She told herself she was leaving. She didn't leave. There is a moment in any mass casualty event when the system reveals its cracks. It is not the first wave of patients. The system handles the first wave on adrenaline and training. It is the second wave arriving before the first has been processed, when the beds are full and the staff is already at capacity and the decisions become impossible equations with no clean answers. The second wave arrived at St. Jude's at 9:14. Sarah was standing near the supply alcove, ostensibly replacing a monitor cable she'd spotted fraying when the radio on charge nurse Hollis's hip crackled. Incoming 6 units ET, a 4 minutes, multiple GSW, multiple blast trauma, 1 priority alpha. Priority alpha. Sarah's hands went still on the cable. Priority alpha meant imminent death without immediate surgical intervention. Priority alpha meant every resource, every bed, every skilled pair of hands needed to be ready. Priority alpha meant the person in that ambulance had perhaps minutes of margin between living and not. And then Dr. Pierce walked in. Dr. Gerald Pierce was the chief of surgery at St. Jude's Memorial, and he carried that title the way some men carry a weapon, visibly, deliberately, as a reminder of what he could do to those beneath him. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular arrogance that grows in men who have been excellent at one very specific thing for so long that they mistake that excellence for general superiority. He was in his domain genuinely brilliant. Sarah had watched him work once through a gallery window, and even she had to acknowledge it. His hands knew things that most surgeons took decades to learn. But brilliant and present were different things. Pierce walked through the ER doors with his phone in his hand mid-conversation, and his eyes swept the room the way a general sweeps a battlefield, not to assess the troops, but to confirm that his presence had been registered. "What's our VIP status?" he said, not to anyone in particular, but loudly enough that someone would have to answer. Diane Hollis answered because Diane always answered. "Senator Marsh's aide is in Trauma 1, stable for now, but we have a priority alpha incoming, Dr. Pierce, 6 minutes out. Who's on trauma call? Dr. Reyes is already in surgery with a, get me Reyes on the radio. She's in the chest, sir. She can't. Then get me whoever's available." He said it the way people say things they consider obvious and are slightly offended by the need to state. He was already moving toward Trauma 1, where the senator's aide lay stable and attended and nowhere near critical. Sarah watched him walk away. She watched Diane Hollis close her eyes for exactly 1 second, the kind of pause that happens when a person swallows something they refuse to say out loud, and then open them and begin barking orders at her nurses with the controlled ferocity of someone carrying twice her designated load. Sarah looked at the trauma bay doors. She looked at the clock. She thought about priority alpha in the ambulance that was now 3 minutes out and the attending physicians currently available to receive that patient. She did the math. The math was bad. The ambulance doors opened at 9:19. The paramedics came through, hot, fast, practiced, calling out numbers like an incantation. Male, approximately 50, blast trauma, GSW right. Shoulder through and through, secondary fragmentation wounds, left side B is 80 over palp, GCS 12 on scene, dropped to 9 en route. Sarah saw him before she processed what she was seeing. The man on the gurney was large, broad-shouldered, even in his current wreckage, with a kind of physical architecture that spoke of a life spent in extreme conditions. His clothing, what remained of it, was tactical, not police, not military in any standard issue sense. something older, quieter, and far more deliberate. And his right arm, the one not bracketed by the shoulder wound, bore a tattoo that Sarah had not seen since the last day of a life she had spent 11 years trying to forget. A very small, very specific insignia. An eagle over a caduceus crossed with a lightning bolt. Her breath left her body. She recognized him. Not his face, exactly, the years and the damage had rearranged that. But the insignia, the build, the particular way his unconscious body still held itself even now with a residual soldier's discipline. She knew who this man was, and more than that, she knew what it meant that he was here. "We need attending on this now," the paramedic was shouting. "Where's my trauma team?" Dr. Kapoor appeared already, pulling on gloves. "Talk to me. P is crashing. He needs a surgical team yesterday. Or isn't available. Reyes is in a chest." "Then who?" The voices layered over each other, urgent and dissonant, and Sarah stood 4 feet away and felt something move through her that she had no word for in the language she currently used. In the language she used to use, the word was activate. "Don't," said one part of her. "You buried this. You walked away. That's not your world anymore." The monitor on the gurney let out a long single-frequency alarm. The man's blood pressure had bottomed. "Don't," said that part of her. "You're a technician. You're nobody here." But her feet were already moving. "His pressure's gone, vasopressor push now." Kapoor was calling out, and the nurse beside him was moving. But there was confusion in the bay. 2 nurses, 1 attending, and a crash cart that was positioned wrong for the angle of the gurney, and 3 seconds of geometric misalignment that nobody was correcting, because nobody was seeing it except, "Move the cart left," Sarah said. Her voice came out even, low, certain. 45 degrees. You're blocking your own access." The nurse looked at her. Confusion flashed across her face. "Do it," Kapoor said, not even looking up from the IV line he was fighting. The cart moved, the angle opened. The nurse's hands found what they needed. Sarah should have stepped back. She told herself to step back. Instead, she moved to the head of the gurney and looked at the man's face. And she looked at his airway and she said, "He's going to aspirate. His jaw position you need to adjust before you push the vasopressor, or the reflex is going to close his airway." Kapoor's eyes came up fast. "Who are you?" "Biomed." "But his airway, I see it." Kapoor's jaw set. He repositioned. The adjustment was small and it mattered enormously. The monitor stopped its single-frequency scream and returned to rapid, thready, inadequate, but present. Sarah breathed. The man on the gurney, the man she recognized, the man with the insignia on his arm, opened his eyes. Not all the way, not with focus, but enough. His eyes found the ceiling first. Then they moved as if pulled by something, and they found her face. She watched him try to place her. She watched the recognition come slow, fragmented like a signal finding its frequency through interference, and she watched his mouth move. She leaned in because she had to, because something told her she needed to hear this. "Medic," he breathed. The word was barely air. "Medic 7. Oh, her blood turned cold. "Don't talk," she said. "Save your oxygen." His hand came up. She didn't know how with his blood pressure, where it was, and it closed around her wrist with a grip that had no business being that strong in a man this close to gone. "Medic 7, he said again. "And then they're coming. Here. Tonight." "Sir, stay still." "The hospital." His voice broke on the words. "They're coming for the senator. You understand, you're a cough that cost him terribly. You're the only one who can." His eyes went to the ceiling. His grip on her wrist did not release. His other hand moved, shaking, deliberate, purposeful, and she realized he was reaching for the marker clipped to the supply tray beside the gurney. The black permanent marker that nurses use to label fluid bags. "Sir, don't." He got it. And with the last reliable motor control he possessed, he pressed the tip against the inside of her left forearm, and he wrote in letters that shook but held Medic 7. Then his hand fell. The monitor shrieked its single note, and the trauma bay became a controlled explosion of voices and movement and the terrible necessary machinery of resuscitation, and Sarah Jenkins stood at the center of it with 2 words written on her arm in black marker, and something that had been asleep for 11 years opened its eyes inside her chest. She looked at the words. She looked at the man. She looked at the door of Trauma 1, where Dr. Gerald Pierce was attending to a stable patient, while a former operative, someone she had known, someone who had known exactly who she really was, lay dying in Bay 2 with a warning on his lips that nobody else in this building was equipped to understand. "They're coming. Here. Tonight." Sarah Jenkins pulled her sleeve down over the words. And then she pulled it back up, because she had spent 11 years hiding, and 11 years was enough. She moved to the nurse's station the way she always moved through this building, efficiently, purposefully, visible enough to not raise questions, forgettable enough to not invite them. She pulled up the evening census on the terminal she was authorized to access for equipment tracking. 3 taps. 4. Senator Marsh's aide, the VIP patient in Trauma 1, had been admitted under a protective detail that the hospital administration had quietly accommodated without public record. The detail, 2 plainclothes agents stationed outside, 1 inside. Standard dignitary protocol. Sarah knew what standard dignitary protocol looked like from the inside of it. From the side of it, most people never saw. She also knew exactly how inadequate it was against what the man on the gurney had just described. "They're coming for the senator, not the aide. The senator." Which meant Senator Marsh himself was somewhere in this building. She confirmed it in 4 more keystrokes, a security-adjacent access she'd had for equipment, maintenance purposes, and had never once abused in 11 years, admitted 2 hours earlier to the cardiac care unit on the 5th floor for what the record listed as observation following cardiac event. Not publicly announced, not known outside a very specific circle. The aide in Trauma 1 was a decoy, or more precisely, the attention on the aide was a decoy. Her mind ran the geometry of it the way it used to run, the geometry of everything back when geometry meant survival. She looked across the ER at charge nurse Hollis, who was running on fumes and fury and the bone-deep professionalism of 20 years. She looked at the trauma bay where Kapoor was fighting to stabilize a man who had used his last reserves to write 2 words on her arm. She looked at Trauma 1 where Pierce was visible through the window phone in hand, again speaking with the kind of ease that belonged to a man who did not yet know what was coming. Pick one, said the part of her that used to make decisions that couldn't be undone. She picked. She walked to the trauma bay first. Kapoor had gotten him back. Barely. The monitor showed a rhythm that was terrible, but present a blood pressure that was catastrophic, but measurable, a situation that was stable in the way that a structure. Fire is stable, technically still standing, but not for reasons that would hold. "He needs a surgical team," Kapoor said, not looking up. "I've got him for maybe 20 minutes before his pressure craters again." "I know," Sarah said. "Reyes is still in the chest. Pierce is, I know where Pierce is." Kapoor looked up at her then, really looked at her, the kind of look that happens when a person is drowning in their situation and someone appears who seems inexplicably to not be. "You're the biomed tech," he said. It was not an accusation, it was almost a question. "I am," Sarah said. "You called his airway adjustment before I did." "Yes." "That's not," he stopped. He looked at her differently. "Who are you?" Sarah looked at the man on the gurney, at the hand that had gripped her wrist, at the face that had found hers across the chaos of the trauma bay. "Right now," she said, "I'm the person who's going to make sure he stays alive long enough for Reyes to get out of that OR. Kapoor stared at her. And then she said quieter, "I'm going to need you to trust me on something that is going to sound completely insane." He looked at his patient. He looked at his monitor. He looked at the door of a trauma bay in a hospital that was cracking at the seams on the worst night any of them had seen. "Talk," he said. Sarah took a breath, and she started to tell him the truth. Not all of it, not yet. She gave him enough to understand that the man on the gurney was not a civilian, that his warning was credible, that the security detail on the 5th floor was insufficient for what may be coming. Kapoor listened without interrupting, which told her something important about him. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. "If you're wrong," he said, "we both lose our jobs tonight." "If I'm right," Sarah said, "losing our jobs will be the good outcome." Another 4 seconds. "What do you need?" he said. She told him. He didn't argue. He moved. And Sarah Jenkins, the woman nobody saw, the technician, the janitor, the invisible fixture of 11 years, turned toward the doors of the emergency department and began to do the things she had spent 11 years convincing herself she would never do again. She began to take charge. The radio on her hip clicked twice. She had borrowed it from the supply cabinet officially for maintenance coordination. the authorization code that gave her access to all internal frequencies, because she was the person who repaired the radios. Nobody had ever questioned why she needed that clearance. Nobody had ever questioned much about Sarah Jenkins. 2 clicks meant the security checkpoint at the ambulance bay had logged an anomaly. She had set up that alert herself 6 minutes ago using access she was not supposed to know how to use. She pressed the radio to her ear. Static. Then a voice she didn't recognize, young, uncertain, out of his depth. Security to anyone, we've got a vehicle in the ambulance lane that isn't logging in our system. Plates they're not coming back on anything. Driver won't. The voice cut out, not because the connection dropped, because the young security guard had stopped transmitting. Sarah stood very still in the middle of the emergency department, with the marker still drying on her forearm, and 11 years of a different life pressing forward through every wall she had built, and she understood with complete clarity that whatever came next was going to happen whether she was ready or not. She had 2 choices. She had always had 2 choices every time, in every version of this situation she had ever faced. Step back or step forward. Sarah Jenkins pressed the radio to her lips. "This is Medic 7, she said. Quiet, clear. I need all non-essential personnel to begin moving toward the interior corridors. Now, quietly, do not use the PA system." A beat of silence on the frequency. Then Diane Hollis's voice, sharp, disbelieving, but underneath the disbelief, something else. Something that sounded almost like finally. "Copy that," Diane said, and Sarah moved. The radio stayed quiet for exactly 3 seconds after Diane Hollis said copy that. 3 seconds. That felt like a held breath, like the moment before a door opens and you still don't know what's on the other side. Then the frequency exploded. "What does that mean, move to interior corridors?" That was one of the younger nurses, Marcus, 26 years old, 3 months off his residency rotation. Good instincts, but no framework yet for a night like this one. "Who is Medic 7 dispatch? Who authorized?" "Jenkins authorized it." Diane cut in, and the way she said it, flat, firm, no decorations, silenced him faster than any explanation would have. Sarah was already moving through the department with her radio clipped back to her hip, her eyes doing what her eyes always did, without her permission: inventory assessment, threat geometry. She counted exits. She counted civilians still in the waiting area 11, sitting in the hard plastic chairs with the particular exhausted patience of people who had been waiting for hours and didn't yet know that waiting was about to become the safest thing they'd done all night. She counted the 2 hospital security guards she could see, both young, both visibly shaken by whatever had happened at the ambulance bay, neither of them trained for anything beyond managing visitor disputes and the occasional combative patient. She needed them anyway. She needed everybody. "Kapoor," she said quietly, appearing at his elbow so suddenly that he startled. "How long does he have?" Kapoor looked at his patient, the man with the insignia, the man who had written her name on her arm, and his face did the calculation that physician faces do, the one where hope and math have a brief private argument. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if his pressure holds. But Sarah, she registered that he'd used her first name. That mattered in a way she didn't have time to think about. Get him to the surgical prep corridor. Not the OR, not yet. The prep corridor outside OR2. It's a controlled space 1 entry point, and Rikus will come out of OR1 through that corridor when she's done. That's not protocol. I know. If Pierce finds out. Pierce, Sarah said, and she said it with the precise calm of someone who has assessed a threat and categorized it, is not my primary concern right now. Kapoor looked at her. There it was again, that look. The one that was trying to reconcile the woman he'd seen mopping floors and fixing monitors with the woman standing in front of him now issuing directives with the quiet authority of someone who had done this before, in places where the consequences of being wrong were not a lawsuit, but a body count. "Okay," he said, "just that. Okay." She put her hand briefly on his arm, a thing she almost never did touch, being something she had carefully rationed for 11 years. "You're doing good work tonight, Kapoor. Keep doing it." He blinked. Then he turned to his patient and started moving, and Sarah turned toward the ambulance bay, and the silence on that security radio frequency that had not broken in 4 minutes pressed against her chest like a hand. The young guard had stopped transmitting. She had to know why. The ambulance bay door was 30 feet away when Dr. Gerald Pierce stepped into her path. He didn't do it on purpose. She understood that immediately. He wasn't looking at her, was barely aware of her existence, as an obstacle was in fact looking past her toward the nursing station with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the world had rearranged itself without his permission and was deeply displeased. "Where is Hollis?" he demanded, to no one specifically, to the general concept of staff. "Right here, Dr. Pierce." Diane materialized from the left corridor with the weariness of a woman who has been answering that question for 20 years. "Sir, we have a situation developing in... I need OR2 prepped. Senator Marsh is being moved from CCU to surgical in the next hour, precautionary procedure, and I want my team assembled." "Sir." Diane's voice didn't rise. It dropped, which was more effective. "We have a potential security threat. I need you to... A security threat." He said it, then watched people repeat things they consider beneath their register of concern. "Hollis, we have a mass casualty incident. We have a VI patient, and you want to talk to me about a security threat based on..." His eyes found Sarah standing 2 feet away, and he stopped. His expression shifted from dismissal to something more pointed. "Based on what this woman told you," Sarah held his gaze. "Based on what a critically wounded special operations veteran told me," she said, before he coded in Bay 2. A beat. "He's alive," she added, because precision mattered. "Dr. Kapoor has him. But what he said before he went down is why I need to get to that ambulance bay, Dr. Pierce, and why I need you to trust me for the next..." "Trust you." He almost laughed. "Not quite. You're a biomed technician. You fix machine. You are..." He stopped himself, and she watched him do it. Watched him choose his words with the care of a man who understood liability even when he was being condescending. "You are not qualified to be issuing security protocols in my hospital. With respect, sir, this conversation is over." He moved a step past her, and the radio on her hip crackled. Not a voice, a sound. The specific acoustic signature of a radio being dropped on a hard floor, transmitting impact, then silence. Every person within earshot went still. Pierce turned back slowly. His face had changed. The arrogance was still there, but something had shifted beneath it, the first cold draft of uncertainty moving through a room that had been too warm. "What was that?" he said. That Sarah said quietly, "is the security guard at the ambulance bay." His radio just hit the floor. 4 seconds of silence. "Call the police," Pierce said. His voice had dropped half an octave without him seeming to notice. "Already requested through Kapoor 5 minutes ago," Sarah said. "ETA is unknown city is burning tonight, Dr. Pierce. Every unit is deployed." She held his gaze. "We are on our own for right now, which means the next decision you make matters very much." She watched him absorb it. She watched the moment when Gerald Pierce, brilliant surgeon, chief of his domain, understood that his domain had just become something different from what he was trained to manage. "What do you need?" he said, quieter now. The exact words Kapoor had said. Different weight coming from this man. Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to go to the 5th floor to Senator Marsh, and I need you to stay with him and not let anyone into that room who isn't wearing a St. Jude's badge that you personally recognize. Can you do that?" "I'm a surgeon, not a pro. You're the most senior person in this building right now," she said, "which means you're the one he'll listen to. Go." Something moved across Pierce's face. Not quite respect, not yet, but something adjacent, the particular expression of a man who is beginning to suspect that he has severely miscalculated who he's been sharing a building with. He went. Diane watched him go. Then she looked at Sarah with 11 years of compressed professional assessment in her eyes. "Jenkins," she said. "Hollis, you better be right about all of this." "So do I," Sarah said, and she pushed through the ambulance bay door. The young security guard was on the floor beside the vehicle checkpoint kiosk, conscious a gash above his eyebrow, bleeding the way head wounds do, dramatically worse looking than it was. He had his hand pressed to it and his eyes up, and when the door opened and he saw Sarah, the relief on his face was so raw it almost broke her composure. "Ma'am, there were 2 of them. They showed credentials. They looked real. I didn't..." "How long ago?" She was already crouching beside him, her hands on his face, checking his pupils without making it clinical, the way she had learned to check people without making them feel like patients. 5, maybe 6 minutes. Which way? Interior door. They had a badge. A St. Jude's badge. It looked completely... A badge, she said, and the cold in her chest always sharpened. Someone had done their homework. Someone had prepared. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned, structured, and time-sensitive. Which interior door? Main corridor. Toward the elevators. Toward the elevators. Toward the 5th floor. She stood up. Stay down, she told him. Keep pressure on that. Help is coming. She pressed her radio into his hand. If anyone comes back through this door who isn't me or wearing blue scrubs, you transmit immediately. One button. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. She looked at him once more. 22 years old, maybe. Someone's son. Doing a job he wasn't trained for on a night that had exceeded every parameter. You did good, she said. You kept transmitting as long as you could. That mattered. She left him and went through the interior door at a pace that was not quite running, because running in a hospital creates panic, and panic was currently her enemy. She needed 30 seconds to think. She used them. 2 individuals' professional credentials heading toward the 5th floor via the main elevator corridor. Senator Marsh was in CCU 5th floor East Wing, room 512, based on the census she'd accessed. Pierce was headed there now. The senator's existing security detail was 2 agents, 1 in the corridor, 1 inside the room. Against 2 trained operatives with inside knowledge of the hospital layout, the elevator corridor was a bottleneck. One way in, one way out, unless you knew about the service stairwell that connected to the CCU nurses' station through a door that required a maintenance key. Sarah had a maintenance key. She had carried it for 11 years. She turned left. The service stairwell smelled like cleaning product in old concrete, and she took it at a pace that her 44-year-old knees registered and her mind overruled. 3rd floor landing. 4th. She was breathing controlled, not the controlled breathing of fitness, but the controlled breathing of someone managing an internal state that had no room to destabilize. They planned this, she thought as she climbed. They knew about the aide being in the ER. They knew about the senator's admission. Someone inside leaked the location. Someone inside. She pushed through the 4th floor door to the stairwell. Landing, paused, listened. Footsteps above her. 1 floor up. Measured pace. 2 sets. She pressed herself against the stairwell wall and did not breathe. The footsteps paused on the 5th floor landing directly above her. A door opened. A voicemail, low professional, said something that distance reduced to a murmur. A second voice responded. Then the door closed. They were on the floor. She had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached the CCU corridor. Pierce was up there. The 2 security agents were up there. Senator Marsh was up there. She went up the last flight in 6 seconds. The 5th floor CCU corridor was the kind of place that exists in the specific quiet of serious illness. Hushed, purposeful, with the low percussion of monitors and the soft efficiency of night shift nurses who had learned to do everything at half the volume of day staff. That quiet shattered the moment Sarah came through the service door. She came through fast and she came through low, which was the kind of entrance that recalibrated every person in the vicinity's understanding of what was happening and what she saw in the corridor door. Resolved itself in her mind in under 2 seconds. 2 figures she didn't recognize, both in orderly uniforms, both moving with the particular controlled efficiency that was nothing like how orderlies moved, were 15 feet from room 512. The corridor security agent was on the floor, not moving. The CCU nurses at the station were pressed back against the wall, hands up, and one of them, a small woman in her 50s named Cheryl, who had once given Sarah half her lunch on a bad day 3 years ago, had her eyes wide and her chin up and was refusing visibly stubbornly to look small despite everything. The 2 operatives heard the door, turned. Sarah had nothing in her hands. That was fine. She had never needed much in her hands. Federal security protocol, she said, and her voice came out with a command authority she had not used in 11 years and which arrived apparently completely intact. Stand down, a beat that lasted 1,000 years. You have no jurisdiction here, one of them said. Male, 40s, the kind of face that gave away nothing. You have 3 seconds to reassess that, Sarah said. Lady, you're a hospital janitor. 2 seconds. And then the door of room 512 opened, and Dr. Gerald Pierce stepped into the corridor with his white coat and his silver hair, in an expression of such towering affronted fury that it physically stopped the first operative mid-motion. "Who the hell are you people?" Pierce said, not as a question, but as a verdict. "And what have you done to my patient's security detail?" Neither operative had calculated for Pierce. That was evident. They'd planned for agents for resistance from trained personnel. They had not planned for a 6'2" silver-haired chief of surgery who looked like he'd been personally insulted and was the kind of man who had never once in his adult life considered the possibility that a room did not belong to him. 2 seconds of recalibration. That was all Sarah needed. She moved. Not violently, she was not trying to be violent, did not want to be had, in fact structured the last 11 years of her life around the deliberate avoidance of violence. But she had been trained by people who understood that the body, once educated in certain ways, does not forget. Her hands found purchase. Leverage was applied. The first operative went off balance in a way that cost him the initiative, and his partner made the mistake of looking at Pierce long enough for Cheryl's small, 50-something, stubborn chin Cheryl from the nurse's station to slam a crash cart into his path with a force that spoke to 11 years of moving heavy equipment through narrow corridors. It wasn't elegant. Real things rarely are. But it was enough. By the time the 5th floor security agent, dazed but conscious, pulling himself upright against the wall, had his hand on his radio, both operatives were contained in the geometric sense, one on the floor, one against the wall, and the corridor holding that particular breathless stillness that descends after violence when everyone is checking their own body for damage and finding with profound relief that they are still intact. Pierce stared at the operative on the floor, then at Sarah. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How," he said, and it was the most unguarded word she had ever heard him produce. "Later," Sarah said. That was Dr. Pierce. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Inside her chest, something was shaking, but the inside of her chest was private. "Is the senator secure?" Pierce blinked, recalibrated. "Yes, he's in the room. Yes." "Then I need you to stay here with the agent until backup arrives. Do not let anyone else into that corridor. Anyone." "Where are you going?" She was already moving back toward the service door. "Back downstairs," she said, "because the man who sent me up here is still dying in Bay 2, and I made him a promise." She didn't wait for his response. She went through the door, and she went down the stairs, and she let herself feel for exactly 4 steps the full weight of what had just happened. The 11 years, the burial, the carefully maintained invisibility, all of it cracked open in the span of 90 minutes like a window she'd believed was sealed. 4 steps. Then she put it back. Not away, she understood now that it was never going to go all the way away again. But back contained manageable. She had work to do. Kapoor had the man. She still hadn't let herself say his name, not even in her own mind, not yet in the surgical prep corridor exactly as she'd asked. The monitor readings were catastrophic but stable in the way that a cliff edge is stable, technically a fixed point, but with nothing good on either side. "He keeps asking for you," Kapoor said before she'd even cleared the door. "He's conscious in and out, but when he's in, he's asking for Medic 7. She walked to the gurney. The man's eyes were open. Barely, but they found her with that same pulled-by-frequency quality they had had in the trauma bay, like something in him was calibrated to locate her even when everything else was failing. "Did you stop them?" he breathed. "5th floor is secure." Something moved across his face, relief enormous and exhausted, and almost too much for his current physiology to manage. "There's a 3rd, he said. Sarah went still. "What 3-person team?" His voice was thread thin. 2 high, 1 low. Classic formation. "The 3rd one?" A pause that cost him. The 3rd one isn't going up. The 3rd one is already inside." "Already inside." She looked at Kapoor. He looked at her. "The ER," she said. "Sarah." She was already at the door. "Stay with him," she said. "Reyes comes out of that OR and you get her here immediately. You understand me? His life depends on the next hour." "Sarah, wait." Kapoor's voice followed her into the corridor. "You can't just keep—" But she was already gone, and the corridor swallowed the sound of his voice, and somewhere in the emergency department below her, a 3rd operative was doing the thing that 3rd operatives in a 3-person formation do. They found the one thing that the other 2 distracted everyone from noticing. She ran. Not hospital pace, not careful pace. She ran. And the words on her forearm, Madix 7 in the handwriting of a man who had known who she really was when she had almost forgotten herself, pressed against the inside of her sleeve like a brand, like a name given back, like a door she had closed 11 years ago and tonight, whether she wanted it or not, was open. She hit the stairwell at full speed and took the floors in the dark the way she had once taken staircases in buildings that were actively trying to kill her by feel by count, by the muscle memory of a body that had been trained to function when every reasonable instinct said stop. Third operative, already inside, low position. She ran the logic as she ran the stairs. A three-person team meant resources coordination and a timeline. The two on the fifth floor had been the distraction loud enough to pull attention upward, dramatic enough to consume the response capacity of everyone in the building. The third person wasn't there to make noise. The third person was there to do the actual work while everyone else was looking at the ceiling. She burst through the ER level door and stopped. The emergency department had changed in the 12 minutes she'd been gone. Hollis had moved the non-critical patients to the interior corridor as instructed, and the waiting area had thinned, and the particular quality of the space now was the quality of a room that was holding its breath. Nurses moving with controlled urgency. Kapoor's bay empty and repositioned. The monitors telling their various stories in beeps and waveforms that she had learned to read the way other people read faces. She read them now, Bay 7. The patient in Bay 7 had arrived in the second wave blast trauma. She remembered a man in his late 30s who had been triaged as stable and parked in a monitored bay while the critical cases consumed the team. She had clocked him on her way through earlier left side fragmentation wounds, dressed and bandaged. BP adequate, GCS 15 alert and oriented. An alert and oriented. Alert and oriented meant watching. Alert and oriented meant cataloging. Alert and oriented in a three-person operational formation meant waiting for the signal that the upper two had drawn sufficient response and then completing the mission objective from inside the hospital, from inside of a monitored bay, from the position of a patient. She walked toward Bay 7 with the pace of someone doing rounds, her face neutral, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes on the monitor above the bay so that anyone watching would see a biomed tech checking equipment and not the woman who was calculating angles and exit points and the distance between Bay 7 and the medication room that adjoined Trauma 1. The medication room that adjoined Trauma 1, where Senator Marsh's aide, the decoy, or so everyone assumed, was currently being attended by two nurses and one very stressed resident. But the senator's aide was not the target. The aide was the access point. She stopped at the foot of Bay 7 and looked at the man in the bed. He looked back at her. And there it was, just for a fraction of a second, just the tiniest recalibration behind his eyes, the infinitesimal shift of a person who has been watching and has now been seen watching. Sarah had spent 11 years becoming invisible. She knew exactly what it looked like when the invisibility failed. She kept her face neutral. She reached up and adjusted the monitor lead on his chest the way she had done 1,000 times in 1,000 bays, her fingers finding the connector with the practiced ease of genuine familiarity. Your laid 2 is showing artifact, she said conversationally to the monitor. Not to him. Is it serious? He said. His voice was controlled, pleasant, the voice of a man performing a reasonable question. Usually not, she said. She looked at him then fully and let him see that she was looking. How are you feeling? Better than I look, he said. That's good, she said, because you look pretty bad. He smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced. It's been a rough night. For everyone, Sarah said. She straightened up. She unclipped the monitor lead and held it in her hand, a prop, a reason to be here, a reason to come back. And she said casually, as if it had just occurred to her, I need to swap this lead out. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Take your time, he said. She walked toward the supply alcove. She did not go to the supply alcove. She went to Diane Hollis, who was 3 bays over with her, back to Bay 7, and she put herself beside Diane at the medication cart, and she said very quietly, very specifically, without moving her mouth more than necessary, Bay 7, don't look, don't react. I need you to get everyone out of Trauma 1 in the next 60 seconds on a pretext. Equipment failure. Anything. Get the nurses and the resident out. Diane's hands continued moving on the medication cart with not a single tremor, 20 years of professional control. And the patient, Diane said, equally quiet, leave him. He's stable and he knows it. A beat. Do it now, Diane. Diane closed the medication cart. She turned in the direction of Trauma 1 with the expression of a woman who has just remembered something important. Yates, she called to the resident inside Trauma 1 in her absolutely normal foghorn voice. I need you and Chen out here. The portable monitor in Bay 3 is showing a conflict with the central system, and I need eyes on it before we have a logging error. It was a perfect pretext, plausible, urgent sounding, completely routine, and absolutely impossible for anyone who didn't know hospital systems intimately to evaluate as false. Yates and Chen emerged from Trauma 1 within 45 seconds. Bay 7's patient watched them come out. Sarah watched him watch them. There the micro shift, the almost imperceptible straightening of posture, the eyes going to the Trauma 1 door and staying there 1 second too long. She moved, not toward him, toward the medication room access that ran behind Trauma 1, the access that Biomed used to service the equipment inside without disrupting patient care, the access that nobody else in this building knew existed in its current configuration, because she had personally rerouted the service conduit 18 months ago when the wall was open for electrical work and had never filed the updated schematic because nobody had ever asked her to. She had the key in the door in 4 seconds. She was inside in 5. The medication room was narrow, and it shared a wall with Trauma 1, and there was a service window originally for passing supplies, now officially decommissioned, and covered by a panel that she had known about since her second year at St. Jude's. She eased the panel aside 1 inch. 2. She could see Trauma 1. She could see the senator's aide stable monitor, steady eyes closed in genuine exhausted sleep. She could see the far door, the one the nurses had used to exit, still swinging slightly on its pneumatic hinge. And she could see the moment it began to open again. Not from the nurse's side, from the corridor side, slowly, the way doors open when someone is testing them rather than using them. Sarah pressed herself against the wall and breathed. The door opened 6 inches. Stopped. A hand appeared at the edge, gloved. She registered, which was wrong for a casual entry, and then the door opened fully, and the man from Base 7 stepped through in the quiet, economical way of someone who has confirmed the room is clear. He had a syringe in his hand, not a hospital syringe. The wrong gauge, the wrong profile, the kind of thing that looked like a medical instrument to anyone without specific knowledge and looked like a weapon to someone who had. Sarah calculated the distance between the medication room service window and the door of Trauma 1. She calculated what she had in her hands, which was a detached monitor lead, and 11 years of rust over skills that had apparently not rusted as completely as she'd hoped. She calculated the distance between the man and the senator's aide. He had 12 feet, he had a syringe, he had the practiced quiet of someone who had done this before and expected to be done in under 20 seconds. She had the service window, which was not wide enough to climb through, and the medication room door, which opened into the main ER corridor and not into Trauma 1, and she had approximately 8 seconds before he reached the bedside. She did the only thing available. She hit the equipment panel on the medication room wall, the one that controlled the monitoring system for Trauma 1, and she cut the power. Every monitor in Trauma 1 went dark and silent simultaneously. The effect was immediate and complete. The senator's aide jolted awake at the sudden absence of sound that had been his audio backdrop, confused and disoriented, and the man from Base 7 stopped moving because a conscious witness is a different calculation than an unconscious target. And the alarms that began screaming at the nurse's station outside were the specific alarms that brought nurses running faster than any other sound in a hospital. 8 seconds. The man from Base 7 looked at the patient, looked at the door, looked at the window in his timeline that had just closed. He turned to leave. Diane Hollis was in the doorway. Diane Hollis, who was 5'4" and 140 pounds, and had spent 20 years being the last line between this hospital's patients and everything that tried to harm them. Equipment failure, physician, error, institutional neglect, and apparently tonight this stood in the doorway with a crash cart that she had positioned there with the same quiet, devastating competence she brought to everything, and she looked at the man from Base 7 with an expression that was not fear. It was not even particularly anger. It was the expression of a woman who has decided. "You're not going anywhere," Diane Hollis said. The man assessed her for exactly 1 second. He made the mistake of seeing 5'4" and 140 pounds and deciding it was an obstacle rather than a threat. He moved to go past her. Sarah came through the medication room door into the corridor at that exact moment, and the geometry closed. And what happened next was not elegant and was not cinematic and lasted about 11 seconds. And at the end of those 11 seconds, the man from Bay 7 was on the floor with a crash cart against his lower body and Diane Hollis's knee on his wrist and the syringe still capped. Sarah confirmed still capped, skittered against the baseboard 6 feet away. The senator's aide was sitting upright in his bed, completely awake, staring through the trauma 1 door with the expression of a man who has just understood that his evening has taken a turn that his briefing did not prepare him for. "It's all right," Sarah said to him from the doorway, and her voice was steady. "You're safe, don't move." He stared at her. "Who are you?" She looked at the words on her forearm. She had pushed her sleeve up sometime in the last 60 seconds without realizing it. "Right now," she said, "I'm the person between you and that syringe." He looked at the syringe on the floor. He looked at Diane still pinning the man's wrist with the focused ferocity of someone who had decided and was not undeciding. He looked at Sarah. "Okay," he said faintly. "Okay." "Hollis," Sarah said. "I've got him," Diane said, and she meant it in every sense. Sarah took the syringe carefully by the cap and dropped it into the sharps container on the wall because a biomed tech's instincts are apparently permanent, and she stepped back into the corridor, and she breathed. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking until this moment, which was how she knew she was still in operational mode. You don't feel the shaking until you stop, and you don't stop until the work is done. She pressed her hands against her thighs and steadied them through will alone and turned her face toward the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. 3-person team. All 3 accounted for. Senator Marsh was secure on the 5th floor with Pierce, who had surprised her. The man in the surgical prep corridor was still alive. She had to believe that had to hold that as fixed, and Reyes would be out of the OR within the next 15 minutes. The city was still burning outside. The police would come when they could. Until they did, what had been an emergency department was now something else, a field position contained defended holding. She had held harder positions, but she had never held them as Sarah Jenkins, biomed tech invisible woman, the one nobody saw. She had held them as someone else, someone she had buried. The words on her arm disagreed with the burial. She was looking at them when Marcus, the young nurse, 26 3 months off residency rotation. Good instincts found her in the corridor. His face was doing 5 things at once, and all 5 of them were some variation of what just happened. "And who are you?" "Are you hurt?" she asked him because his arm was pressed against his side in a way that suggested impact. I hit the door frame when everyone," he stopped, reorganized. "Jenkins, Sarah, how did you know there was someone in Base 7 of formation theory?" she said. "2 high, 1 low. The low one is always already inside." He stared at her. "Where did you learn? How do you even—" "Marcus." She put her hand on his arm the second time tonight she had touched someone, and she felt him steady under it, the way young people sometimes do when someone older gives them a physical point of contact in the middle of chaos. "You've done good work tonight. Real good. When this is over, I need you to write down everything you saw in order with times. Can you do that?" "Why?" "Because people aren't going to ask and your account matters. Do you understand?" "Oh," he nodded. Something in his posture changed, not quite taller, but more grounded, like he'd been given a framework for what the night meant, and the framework was helping. "Go check on Cheryl in the CCU," Sarah said. "She held the line up there, and she probably won't tell anyone she needs to sit down, so make sure she gets to sit down." He went, and she watched him go, and she let herself feel for exactly 1 moment how young he was, and how well he had moved through the night, and how much it mattered that people like him existed in places like this. Then her radio, she had a second one now, borrowed from the security office, clicked 3 times. 3 clicks was Pierce's signal. She had told him 3 clicks means "I need you come to the 5th floor, no words over open radio." 3 clicks was the signal they had agreed on when she was leaving the CCU corridor. She had not expected to hear it. She stared at the radio. 3 clicks again. She moved toward the stairwell. She was on the 3rd floor landing when her mind gave her the thing it had been withholding. The thing it protected her from processing while she was still operational, still moving, still needed. The thing that surfaced now in the specific quiet of a stairwell that smelled like concrete and industrial cleaner. The man on the gurney, the insignia, the handwriting on her arm. She knew who he was. Not a stranger, not a face from a vague past. She knew him. She had known him in the life before this one, in the years before St. Jude's and biomed certification, and the deliberate slow burial of everything she'd been. He had been her commanding officer for 2 years, in places that did not appear on unclassified maps. He had been the man who signed her discharge papers and shook her hand and looked at her with an expression she had never fully decoded, not quite sorrow, not quite respect, something that held both and something older than either. He had come here tonight to the city, to this hospital, already wounded, already targeted. He had come through the doors of the ER knowing he was dying, and the one thing he had used his last functioning capacity to do was to find her and put her name back on her own arm. Why her? Why here? Why tonight? Why had he known she was here at all? She didn't have that answer yet. But she understood on the 4th floor landing, breathing hard in a stairwell, with her sleeve pushed up and black marker on her forearm, that whatever the answer was, it was going to change the rest of her life. She had felt that before. The moment when the path branches and you understand viscerally that you are already on the new one and the old one is behind you and the only direction that exists anymore is forward. She had felt it when she enlisted. She had felt it when she picked up a medical kit in a situation that required one and discovered that her hands knew what to do before her mind had approved the decision. She had felt it the morning she walked into St. Jude's Memorial Hospital for the first time, badge clipped to her chest, mop in one hand, and made herself small and quiet and forgettable. She felt it now on the 4th floor landing going up. 5 clicks on the radio, Pierce again more urgent. She ran the last flight. The 5th floor corridor was different from how she'd left it. The 2 operatives had been secured. She could see the restraint situation from 30 feet away, hospital security having arrived in force finally, and managed the containment with the excessive caution of people who were very much out of their depth but trying. The CCU nurses were back at their station. Cheryl was standing still, chin still up. Sarah made a note to make good on what she told Marcus. Pierce was at the far end of the corridor outside room 512. He was not alone. The man beside him was in his 60s, silver-haired, carrying the specific weight of someone who had spent decades making decisions with large consequences. He was in a hospital gown which should have diminished him, and did not, because some people's authority is load-bearing in a way that clothing cannot touch. Senator Marsh looked at Sarah as she came down the corridor. He looked at her the way the man on the gurney had looked at her. The same quality, the pulled-by-frequency quality. And before she reached them, before she was even close enough for a normal conversation, the senator said in a voice that carried without effort, "You must be Medic 7. Sarah stopped walking. Pierce looked between them. She watched him understand that there was an entire dimension to this night that he had not been shown. "Senator," she said carefully. "He told me you were here," Marsh said, "years ago. He told me that if things ever went wrong, if I was ever in a situation and he wasn't available, I should find the woman at St. Jude's who fixes the machines and cleans the floors." He paused. He said she was the best field medic he'd ever served with, and the most stubborn person he'd ever tried to keep on a team. Sarah didn't speak. "He was right about both," Pierce said quietly to no one in particular. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. "He's still alive," Sarah said. She said it directly to the senator, and she said it the way she said things when she needed them to be true through the force of her own refusal to accept alternatives. "He's in the prep corridor. Reyes is going to get to him." Marsh nodded once, the nod of a man who has learned over decades how to receive terrible and hopeful information simultaneously. "He came to warn me himself," the senator said. "Even like that, even already." He stopped, chose a different word. "He came anyway." "Yes," Sarah said, "that's the kind of person he is." "Yes," Sarah said again. The corridor held the 3 of them in a silence that was not empty, but full of everything the night had been, everything it had cost, and everything that still had to be decided about what came next. Then Sarah's radio crackled, Kapoor's voice, and the sound behind it, the specific sound she had been waiting for and dreading simultaneously, the sound of a surgical team in motion. "Reyes is out," Kapoor said. She's with him now, Sarah. She says she can do it. She says he has a chance. Sarah put her hand over the radio. She pressed it against her chest over the place where something had been shaking quietly since the moment she'd come through the ER doors, and she held it there for 3 seconds. Then she pressed the transmit button. Tell Reyes, she said, that he doesn't get to die tonight. Tell her that's an order from Medic 7. A beat. Kapoor's voice was something underneath it that she had no word for. Copy that. She clipped the radio back to her hip. She looked at Senator Marsh. She looked at Dr. Pierce, who was watching her with the expression of a man who was not going to be the same person he'd been this morning and was only beginning to understand that. We need to talk about what happens next, she said. And for the first time in 11 years, Sarah Jenkins stood at the front of her room and let herself be seen. All of her, the tech, the medic, the woman who had buried one life under another and spent a decade being invisible by choice, and tonight against every intention had become exactly what the black letters on her arms said she was. Medic 7. No longer buried, no longer invisible. Present. The talking happened in the CCU family consultation room, which was the only space on the 5th floor, with a door that closed completely and walls that absorbed sound. Senator Marsh sat in one of the chairs without being invited to the way men of his particular gravity inhabit spaces, not with arrogance, but with the ease of someone who has spent so long making decisions in rooms that the room itself adjusts. Pierce stood near the door, his white coat still immaculate despite everything the night had put him through, which Sarah found somehow both absurd and admirable. She stood because she always stood when she needed to think clearly, and right now she needed to think more clearly than she had in 11 years. How long have you been here? Marsh said, not accusing, genuinely asking. At St. Jude's 11 years. 11. He said it softly like a number that meant something specific to him. He looked for you for 2 of those. After your discharge. Something moved through her chest. She kept it off her face. I didn't want to be found. I know. He knew too. He stopped looking. Marsh paused. But he kept track. That's different from looking. He just needed to know you were somewhere safe. Sarah looked at the wall. She was not going to do this now. She was not going to feel the full weight of what it meant that the man currently on a surgical table 2 floors below had spent years knowing where she was leaving her alone because she'd asked for that without words and then crossed a burning city in a deteriorating body to write her name on her arm because the situation had finally become the one situation where leaving her alone was no longer something he could justify. She was not going to feel that right now. Senator, she said, I need to know who sent that team, and I need to know what you know about why tonight. Marsh looked at her steadily. That's a conversation I normally have with people who carry federal credentials. I used to carry federal credentials, she said. I turned them in, along with everything else. I'm aware. And then you understand that what I'm carrying now is 11 years of distance from all of this and a marker on my arm. And the fact that your security detail is on the floor and your aide nearly got a syringe in his IV, and 3 operatives with inside knowledge of your location are currently being held by hospital security and regular police. She stopped, took a breath. So I would appreciate whatever you can tell me, sir, because I am trying to decide how much deeper into this I go tonight, and that decision requires information. Pierce made a small sound. She glanced at him. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who was revising a very long document very quickly. Marsh was quiet for 4 seconds. There's a Senate committee vote in 36 hours, he said finally. Infrastructure bill, on its surface, underneath. He paused, choosing his level of disclosure. Underneath it involves defense contracts worth approximately $40 billion over 10 years, and the allocation of certain class 5 program funding that several parties find inconvenient. Another pause. Parties who have apparently decided that my absence from that vote is worth considerable investment. $40 billion, Pierce said. He sounded like a man hearing a number his brain was struggling to process as real. Give or take, Marsh said dryly. Sarah absorbed it. The scale was large, but scale didn't surprise her anymore. She had operated in the arithmetic of large consequences long enough to know that the size of the number almost never correlated with the humanity of the decision. People died for $40 billion the same way they died for $40. The math changed. The dying didn't. The inside leak, she said. Someone told them which hospital you were in, which floor, the AIDS room as a decoy, the layout of the CCU. She paused. That's not public information and it's not guessable. Someone with access provided it. Yes, Marsh said, someone on your detail administration. I don't know yet. And the weight of those 4 words from a man who was accustomed to knowing to having apparatus around him that produced knowing was considerable. She stood with that for a moment. Then she said, is there anyone coming federally? Response team security augmentation, anything? 30 minutes out, Marsh said. Maybe 40. I had a secure line to my chief of staff from the CCU before your Dr. Pierce arrived. They're moving. 30 minutes, Sarah said. Is that a problem? She thought about the 3 contained operatives. She thought about the burning city and the stretched police resources. She thought about the 11-year-old hospital security infrastructure that had already exceeded its design parameters by about 300% tonight. It's manageable, she said. Marsh studied her. You know, he said he told me something else about you. He said that you had the rarest quality he ever encountered in the field. She waited. He said you never lied about what was possible. Marsh's voice was even, but it carried something underneath it. Not up, not down. You assessed and you reported, and what you said was real. He said he made better decisions around you than he made anywhere else because he always knew exactly what he was actually working with. The room was very quiet. Pierce was looking at the floor. Sarah said, he was a good commander. He was, Marsh agreed. Hey, she repeated. She said it the way she'd said it to Kapoor about the radio as declaration, as refusal, all as the only version she was willing to hold in her hands right now. Her radio clicked, not Pierce's 3-click signal. 1 click, then a pause, then 2 clicks. Kapoor. Their private code worked out in the surgical prep corridor 1-2 meant he needed her non-emergency come when able. She looked at Marsh. I need to go downstairs. Of course. She was at the door when his voice stopped her. Ms. Jenkins. She turned. When this is over, he said, I'd like to speak with you about a few things. Formally, with some people from my office. I figured, she said. I want to be clear that it's not a requirement. I know it's not, she held his gaze. I'll hear what you have to say. She left. Pierce followed her into the corridor, which she hadn't expected. She glanced at him. I owe you something, he said, stiff. The particular stiffness of a proud man constructing an apology without a template for it. She waited. I treated you as... He stopped. Tried again. For 11 years, I have worked in the same building as you, and I never once another stop. I was wrong about what I was looking at. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 11 years of being looked through. She thought about the particular weight of invisibility that is not chosen but assigned the invisibility that comes from rank and title and the unconscious calculus of who matters in a hierarchy. She thought about how easy it would be to let the anger in now that there was room for it. How justified. How useless. You're a good surgeon, Dr. Pierce, she said. What you did tonight, going to that floor, staying with the senator, holding the room that mattered. You did that. He blinked. He had, she understood, been braced for something else. That's I don't deserve. It's not about deserving, she said. It's about what you did. You did good work tonight. She paused. We can talk about the rest of it later. When there's time. She didn't wait for his response. She moved toward the stairwell, and she heard him behind her, not following, just standing in the corridor, holding what she'd given him, which was more complicated than absolution and more useful than anger. Kapoor was in the surgical corridor outside OR2, his scrub cap pushed back on his forehead, the specific exhaustion of an ER physician at the end of a mass casualty incident written into every line of his posture. He looked up when Sarah came through the door, and his face did a rapid sequence she had come to recognize as his particular form of relief, a tightening, then a release, like a hand gripping something and then trusting it can let go. Reyes has been in there 40 minutes, he said. How was he when she opened? Bad. He said it plainly, the way good doctors say hard things. But she's Reyes, too. So, Sarah agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you want to tell me who he is? She had known this was coming. She had been deciding since the stairwell how much of it to give and how much to hold. Not because she wanted to deceive Kapoor, she had developed over the course of this extraordinary night something that felt very much like trust in this man, which was not something she extended quickly or slightly, but because some of it was not hers to give. He was my commanding officer, she said, a long time ago. Kapoor absorbed this. Special operations. Yes. And you were, I was a medic. She glanced down at her forearm. Among other things. Medic 7. That's what they called me. He was quiet again longer this time. Then the things you did tonight, the airway call, the formation theory, moving the security detail, reading the third operative, the medication room panel. He stopped. None of that is biomed training, Sarah. No, she agreed. That's what is that? She looked at him. That's 11 years ago, she said. That's a person I used to be, and a life I put down, and a job I have been very deliberately, very intentionally not doing for a long time. A pause until tonight. Why tonight? She showed him her arm. He looked at the words. He looked at her face. He said very quietly, because he asked you to. Because he needed me to, she said. There's a difference. He asked me 11 years ago. He asked me to be careful, to be safe, to find somewhere quiet and stay there. And I did. And tonight he needed something different from me, and he knew I was the only one here who could. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Let the sentence find its ending without her help. Kapoor finished it for her gently. Who could bring him back? The OR doors were still closed. The monitor above the scrub sink showed the operative stats relaying from inside. She could read them from here, had learned to read them from distances like this, because in the field you were never as close as you needed to be, and you learned to work with what you could see. The numbers were terrible. The numbers were holding. He's fighting, she said. She said it to the monitor, to the closed door, to the 40 minutes of Reyes's hands working on the inside of him. He always fought. Tell me about him, Kapoor said. She looked at him surprised. You've been carrying this alone all night, Kapoor said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the thing a good doctor says when they understand that the person in front of them has been treating their own internal bleeding by applying pressure and pretending it isn't there. I'm not going anywhere. The OR is closed. Talk to me. Sarah sat down on the quarter bench the first time she had been off her feet. In over 2 hours, she realized, and the information traveled up through her legs in a wave of delayed sensation. She looked at the OR doors. His name is Colonel Raymond Decker, she said. Retired, officially. She paused. He ran a unit that operated in threat environments where standard military assets couldn't be deployed. Small teams, high autonomy, the kind of work that doesn't appear in any report that any civilian oversight committee ever reads. And you were on his team. I was his medic for almost 4 years. She paused again. He didn't find me. I found him. I was already in the Army, already field certified, and I applied for the unit through channels that most people don't know exist. He interviewed me himself, 45 minutes. He asked me 12 questions, and then he said, "You're in Jenkins, and if you die on my watch, I will be extremely annoyed." And that was the most warmth he expressed in the first 6 months. Kapoor made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's a recommendation. From Decker, that was practically a declaration of love. She felt the corner of her mouth move. He cared about his people in the way that people care about things they refuse to admit they care about. You could see it in what he did, how he positioned the team, how he took the harder angle so someone else could have the safer one, how he remembered things, your family, your history, your particular fears, and used that knowledge to protect you rather than to manipulate you. What happened, Kapoor said, to make you leave? A long pause. The OR monitor held steady. She watched the numbers. A mission went wrong, she said, the way missions go wrong that nobody plans for and nobody fully recovers from. We lost 2 people, good people, people I had kept alive through things that should have killed them 3 times over, and then on an ordinary day in an ordinary situation I couldn't. She pressed her hands against her thighs. I did the math after, and the math was correct. There was nothing I could have done differently. Decker told me that. 3 separate doctors told me that. I knew it was true, and I couldn't stop. She stopped. I couldn't stop running the numbers. Kapoor was very still. So you left, he said. I left, I got out, I came here, I took a job that was about maintaining things rather than losing them, and I got very good at being nobody. She looked at the marker on her arm. I thought I was done. I thought the chapter was closed. Chapters don't close, Kapoor said. They just go quiet. She looked at him. That's not something they teach you in medical school, he said. That's something my mother told me after my father died. She said grief doesn't end. It just gets quieter, and the quiet is not the same as gone. He paused. I think that might be true of other things too. Sarah looked at the OR doors. She was saved from having to respond to that by the sound of those doors opening. Reyes came out in a way that surgeons come out after the hardest cases, carrying the weight of the work on her shoulders, moving with the controlled fatigue of someone who has been completely inside a moment for a long time and is now returning to ordinary air. She pulled her mask down. She looked at Sarah. He's stable, she said. The corridor breathed. He is going to be in recovery for a long time, Reyes continued, and the next 24 hours are critical. But the bleed is controlled, the pressure is normalized, and he is... She paused and something moved briefly across her very tired face. He is the most stubborn physiological case I have ever had on my table. His body refused to quit. Refused. She shook her head. I have never seen anything quite like it. Sarah pressed both hands flat against her thighs and stared at a point 6 inches above the OR door and did not speak for 4 seconds. Can I see him? She said. Recovery protocol is 5 minutes, Sarah said. I just need 5 minutes. Reyes looked at her. She had not been in the building for the events of the night, had come out of the OR into a situation she was still assembling, but she was a woman who read rooms and people the way surgeons learn to by necessity, and what she read in Sarah's face in that moment made the protocol argument die before she finished forming it. 5 minutes, Reyes said. The recovery alcove was small and quiet and full of the sound of monitors that were saying in their steady mechanical language that Raymond Decker was alive. He was unconscious, proper post-surgical unconsciousness, the deep, still kind that is not frightening when you understand it. His face, without the emergency, without the urgent, terrible focus of a man using his last resources to deliver a warning, was she had not let herself look at it properly before now. She looked at it now. He was older. Of course he was. She had not seen him in 11 years. And time does its work on everyone, but the architecture was the same, the jaw, the set of the brow, the particular quality of stillness that Raymond Decker carried even unconscious, as if his body understood that stillness was a posture and not a default. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She was not going to be sentimental. She was not the sentimental kind, had spent 44 years successfully not being the sentimental kind, and the fact that her vision was doing something slightly unclear at the edges was purely a function of extended high-stress operation on inadequate sleep. She looked at his hand on the bed, the hand that had gripped her wrist with impossible strength, the hand that had written on her arm. She did not reach out and take that hand. She was not that person. She sat beside him, and she said very quietly to the unconscious man, "You are the most inconvenient person I have ever known, Decker. You know that 11 years. 11 years, I am left alone, and then..." She stopped. "And then you walk into my emergency department and you die in front of me and expect me to just..." She pressed her lips together. "You're not allowed to die," she said, firm, the same firmness she'd put into the radio transmission to Kapoor. "I told Reyes that's an order from Medic 7. A pause. "I am aware you outrank me, and I am choosing not to care about that right now." The monitors held their steady language. "Alive, alive, alive. I found the third one," she said. "Hollis helped. Hollis is you would like Hollis." She held a crash card on a trained operative with the energy of someone who had been waiting her entire career for someone to try that in her hospital. She almost smiled. "The senator is secure. The team is contained. 36 hours to the vote." She looked at his face. "You did your job, Decker. Now let Reyes do hers." She stood. She looked at him one more moment, let herself look fully, without the operational filter. Just as herself, just Sarah, just the woman who had walked away from this world and tonight had the world walk back through the doors and find her anyway. Then her radio clicked. One click, long pause, one click. Pierce's adaptation of the code, he'd listened more carefully than she expected. It meant come to the lobby. Now. She turned away from the bed. In the hallway outside, Marcus was waiting for her with a paper cup of terrible hospital coffee extended toward her like a peace offering or a small flag of care, and she took it without breaking stride, and he fell into step beside her, and she thought this is what it looks like when people hold a line together. Not glory, not speeches. A cup of bad coffee passed between two people walking fast toward whatever comes next. The federal team is downstairs, Marcus said. 3 vehicles, lots of suits. How many were going on? 8, maybe 10. Are they talking to anyone yet? They're looking for you, he said. Specifically, they asked Hollis, and Hollis told them. He paused. She told them you were the one running the medical response and the security response, and that if they had questions, they could wait for you to be ready. Sarah almost stopped walking. She said that, Sarah said. Word for word, Marcus said. And then she went back to her nurse's station and didn't look at them again. 20 years, Sarah thought. 20 years of Diane Hollis holding this department together with competence and invisible labor and the particular dignity of a woman who never got the acknowledgement her work earned. And tonight, Diane had held a crash cart on a trained operative and told federal agents to wait. Some people, Sarah thought, you spend years working beside and never fully see. And then a night like this one strips the surface off everything and shows you what was always there. Tell them I'll be down in 5, Sarah said. She diverted to the nurse's station instead. Diane was behind it actually writing on paper because Diane Hollis had never fully trusted electronic documentation, and tonight was not the night that was going to change her mind. She didn't look up when Sarah stopped at the counter. Hollis, Sarah said. Jenkins, still writing. What you did tonight. What I did tonight is my job, Diane said. She turned a page, still not looking up. What you did tonight is apparently about 12 different jobs I didn't know you had. Diane, she looked up. Thank you, Sarah said. I mean that. Not for the job. She gestured inadequately at the shape of the entire night. For trusting me. Diane looked at her for a long moment. 20 years of shared space. 11 years of Sarah being invisible and Diane being the kind of person who noticed invisible things without making a performance of it. I always trusted you, Diane said. I just didn't know the full inventory. She went back to her writing. Now go deal with your federal agents before they start contaminating my intake logs with their questions. Sarah went. The lobby was full of people in the specific clothing of federal seriousness, dark, understated, equipped. They turned when she came through the door, with a collective calibrated attention that she recognized as training, and the one at the front, a woman 50s with the kind of face that had stopped performing patients a long time ago and was now simply efficient, looked at Sarah and said, Ms. Jenkins. Agent Carver, Director Carver. A pause that held its own weight. I've been briefed on the events of the evening. I need a full account. You can have it, Sarah said, but first I need to know the status of the city's situation and the timeline on the vote security, because if the answer to either of those is insufficient, I have a senator on the 5th floor who's going to have opinions. Carver looked at her, the look of a woman recalibrating. The city situation is being managed, Carver said, and the vote security has been augmented as of 40 minutes ago. A pause. Your call to Kapoor, who called his department head, who called the hospital administrator, who happened to have a direct line to the deputy security secretary, that chain moved faster than standard protocol. Significantly faster. Good chains do that, Sarah said, another recalibration look. Ms. Jenkins, I've been doing this work for 22 years. Carver paused. What you managed in this building tonight with the resources you had. She stopped. It was not a woman who stopped often. I would like to talk to you about your future plans. Sarah looked at her. She looked at the agents behind her and the lobby around her and the hospital that was battered and holding and the stairwell beyond that door that led to a recovery room on a floor above where Raymond Decker was breathing, which was the only thing she had asked for tonight and which had been given. Director Carver, she said, I have a ventilator fan assembly in sub-basement 2 that I left half repaired at 8 o'clock this evening. Carver blinked. I beg your pardon. Someone's going to need that ventilator before morning, Sarah said. So I need to finish what I started. She paused. Then I'll answer your questions. She walked past the federal agents through the lobby toward the elevator And nobody stopped her because nobody stopped Sarah Jenkins when she was doing her job. All of her jobs, all of her finally at once. The ventilator fan assembly was exactly where she'd left it. Sub-basement 2 at 2:17 in the morning was the quietest place in St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, which was saying something on a night when quiet had become a relative concept. Sarah sat at the workbench with the fan assembly in her hands and the toolkit open beside her, and she let her hands do the thing her hands knew how to do without instruction, and she let the rest of her, the part that had been running at operational capacity for the last 5 hours, begin very carefully to stand down. The screwdriver turned, the housing aligned, the fan seated. She had rebuilt this particular unit 3 times in 18 months. She knew its failure points the way she knew the failure points of most things she had spent enough time with, intimately, without sentimentality, with the practical affection of someone who understood that maintenance was not a lesser form of care, but the most honest form of it. You didn't maintain things you didn't value. You didn't show up for the broken and the malfunctioning and the overlooked unless some part of you had decided at a level below conscious thought that those things deserved to keep running. That was why she had come here 11 years ago. That was why she had stayed. She set down the screwdriver and looked at her hands. The marker on her forearm had smudged at the edges. Medic 7 still legible, still present, the ink worn, but not gone the way some things wear, but do not disappear. She had not washed it off. She had thought about it once on the 3rd floor landing and had decided without deciding the way she made most of her real decisions. Her radio clicked. 1-2. Kapoor. She picked it up. "Talk to me. He's asking for you." Kapoor's voice had the quality of someone who had been awake too long and found on the other side of exhaustion a particular clarity. "He's been in and out for the last 40 minutes, but when he's in, he asks for Medic 7. Reyes says his vitals are moving in the right direction." Sarah set the fan assembly down. "I'm coming up." She reassembled her toolkit in the specific order. She always reassembled it, not compulsion, just efficiency, the kind of efficiency that becomes ritual over years. And she looked once at the workbench and at the repaired unit and at the basement that had been her first territory in this building, the place she had claimed before she claimed anything else. Then she went upstairs. Decker was awake, not fully, not with the complete oriented consciousness that would come later, that would require days and careful management, and the particular patience of a man who had spent a career moving fast, learning to accept the necessary stillness of recovery. But his eyes were open and tracking when she came through the recovery room door, and they found her with that same frequency pull that had been happening all night, as if some navigational system in him had been calibrated to her specifically and had not bothered to update its settings in 11 years. "Jenkins," he said. His voice was rough and thin and entirely unmistakably his. "Decker," she said. She sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair. She had not consciously chosen it. "You stopped them," he said. "We stopped them," she said. "Me, Kapoor Hollis, a 26-year-old nurse with good instincts and a charge nurse who used a crash cart as a weapon." She paused. "Pierce was useful too. Don't tell him I said that." Something moved in Decker's face. It took her a moment to identify it because she had seen it so rarely. He was almost smiling. "Pierce," he said, "chief of surgery. Impressive ego turns out reasonable under pressure." Another pause. "He looked at me differently after. They all did." "They should have been looking at you correctly for 11 years, Decker said. The words landed in the room and sat there. "You knew I was here," she said. "Not an accusation, a fact being examined." "Yes." "For how long?" 8 months after your discharge. I found the employment record." A long, slow breath. "I closed the file, Sarah. I want you to know that. I didn't surveil, I didn't monitor. I just needed to know you'd landed somewhere." He stopped, chose his words with the care of a man who had spent a lifetime in the business of precision. "Somewhere that wasn't a war zone." "And then you came anyway," she said. "And then I came anyway," he agreed. "Because there was nobody else. Because the team that should have had this had been compromised. Because I was the only one who knew where you were and what you could." He stopped again. "Because I was in that ambulance and I was running out of time, and the only calculation that made sense was you." Sarah looked at his face. She had spent 11 years not looking at this face, not allowing herself to think about it, not revisiting the years that contained it. And here it was in a recovery room at 2:30 in the morning, worn and damaged and alive, looking back at her with the full unguarded honesty of a man who has come too close to not having another conversation. "You should have called," she said. "You would have run," he said. She opened her mouth, closed it. "You would have," he said without judgment. "And I understand why, and I needed you to not run tonight. So I made a choice he held her eyes, that I will let you be angry about Sarah, if you need to be." She was quiet for a long time. The monitors held their steady language. Outside the recovery room, the hospital was doing what hospitals do at 3 in the morning, holding life in place stubbornly against everything that pressed against it. "I'm not angry," she said finally. She stopped, looked at her hands. "I'm trying to figure out what I am." "Take your time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere for a while." "No," she agreed, "you're not." His eyes closed briefly. Not unconsciousness fatigue, the legitimate kind, the kind that arrives after the body has been permitted to stand down from crisis. When they opened again, they were slightly less focused, slightly more present in the way that heavily medicated people are present, closer to the surface of themselves than usual. "They're going to ask you things," he said. "Carver, her people." "I know. You don't have to say yes." "I know that too. Whatever you decide," his voice was getting slower, the medication asserting itself. "Whatever you decide, Sarah, it's right, whichever one it is." She looked at him, at the man who had given her a call sign in an authority she'd spent 11 years laying down, at the face that was she understood now with the clear vision that comes at 3 in the morning when all the defenses are tired, the face of someone who had known her completely and chosen to protect that knowing by giving her the distance she needed rather than the proximity he might have preferred. "Sleep," she said. "Bossy," he murmured. "I'm Medic 7, she said. "In my trauma bay, I outrank you." He was asleep in 40 seconds. She sat for another 5 minutes, just sat, present quiet in the chair beside the bed in the hospital that was hers, in a way she had never said out loud, but had always felt in the part of herself that didn't have a title for things, just a sense of them. Then she stood up and she went to find Director Carver. Carver had taken over the hospital administrator's conference room, which told Sarah something about the woman's operational instincts. Not the lobby, not the ER, but the room with the door that locked and the table large enough for a working group and the window position that allowed observation of the main corridor. Good instincts, territorial in the functional, rather than the ego-driven sense. There were 4 people in the room when Sarah arrived. Carver, 2 agents whose names she wasn't given and didn't ask for, and unexpectedly, Senator Marsh still in his hospital gown, with a blanket over his shoulders, sitting at the head of the table with the specific unself-conscious authority of a man who considers his own dignity non-negotiable regardless of what he's wearing. Sarah sat down. Carver pushed a folder across the table. Sarah didn't open it. "I'll listen first," Sarah said. Carver nodded. "There is an opening in a specialized advisory capacity within the Office of National Security Infrastructure. The role involves threat assessment and response protocol development for civilian institutions, hospitals, transit systems, utilities, places that have become targets but are not structured for the kind of threat architecture they're now facing." She paused. "Tonight is not the first incident of this type. It will not be the last. We need people who can think the way you think, Ms. Jenkins, who understand both the medical environment and the threat landscape." Sarah looked at the folder. "In the operational component, strictly advisory," Carver said, "no field deployment. You would not be returning to the work you left." "But I would be returning to the world that work came from." "A different part of it," Carver said, "with different parameters and full civilian status." Marsh spoke for the first time. "I asked for this position to be created," he said plainly. 3 months ago, after a similar incident in a different city that was handled badly because nobody in the room understood what they were actually facing. He looked at her. "I didn't know it was going to be you." But Decker, before all of this, weeks ago, in a different conversation about the threat assessment, he mentioned that the right person for that kind of role would be someone who had lived in both worlds and chosen the civilian one. Someone who understood what was worth protecting and had decided to be in the room with it. A pause. "He wasn't recommending you specifically. He was describing a type. And then tonight happened, and here you are, and the description fits. Sarah looked at the table. She looked at the folder. She looked at the senator in his hospital gown, and Carver with her efficient face and the two unnamed agents who were watching her with the professional assessment that she recognized because she had worn it herself a long time ago. She thought about sub-basement 2. She thought about the ventilator fan assembly repaired and ready. She thought about Marcus with his paper cup of terrible coffee, and Cheryl at the nurse's station with her chin up, and Diane Hollis writing on paper because she trusted paper and not one word of complaint through the whole long, violent, extraordinary night. She thought about what it meant to choose among them. Whether you made that choice once at a dramatic crossroads, or whether you made it again and again in small decisions that accumulated over years until they became who you were to. She opened the folder. She read it. It took 4 minutes. She read everything the way she read everything fully without skimming, noting what was said and what was deliberately not said, and what the spaces between the language were holding. She turned the last page. She closed the folder. "I have conditions," she said. Carver's expression didn't change, but something behind it did fractionally in the direction of respect. "Tell me." "I keep my position at St. Jude's, Sarah said. "Part-time if necessary for scheduling, but I keep it. I don't disappear from this building." "That's workable," Carver said. "The advisory work is genuinely advisory. If I say a civilian institution is not equipped for a specific threat protocol and needs resources, that assessment is acted on." "Not filed." "Greedon." "And Decker." She said his name steadily, without the weight she felt behind it showing in her voice, because some things you carry and do not display. "Whatever ongoing operation he was involved in that brought him here tonight, I want the full brief. Not a summary, the full picture." A pause, longer than the others. Carver looked at Marsh. Marsh gave a very slight nod. "That can be arranged," Carver said. Sarah looked at the folder in front of her. She thought about 11 years. She thought about what Kapoor's mother had said about grief going quiet but not gone, and how that was true of other things too, of skills of identity, of the parts of yourself that you put down but never fully put away. She thought about the words on her arm. She thought about what it meant that those words were still there, still legible, still hers. "All right," she said. Carver extended her hand across the table. Sarah looked at it for 1 second, 1 breath, 1 moment of standing at the edge of a path she had once left and was now, eyes open, walking back onto on her own terms, and then she took it. The handshake was brief and firm and final. At 4:40 in the morning, Sarah Jenkins walked back through the emergency department. The worst of the night had passed. The casualties had been processed, the critical ones stabilized or transferred or lost. There had been losses, there always were, and she felt each one as the specific absence. It was not blurred, not categorized, just felt. The city was still burning in pockets, but the fire was being met now, contained the way fires eventually are when enough people stop watching and start moving. The department was quieter. Not empty, a hospital is never empty, but the fevered pitch had dropped to something manageable, and the people still working wore the particular expression of those who have come through the worst of something and are still on their feet, which is its own form of triumph. Marcus was at the nurse's station writing his account exactly as she'd asked, with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that what he wrote would matter. He looked up when she passed. She gave him a nod that said, "Good work. I see it counts." He straightened like someone had given him something solid to stand on. Kapoor was in the break room with a coffee. He wasn't drinking, staring at the table with the 1,000-yard quality of an ER physician at the end of an impossible shift, processing the gap between what he'd trained for and what the night had actually required. He looked up when she stopped in the doorway. "He's stable," she said. "Reyes says the next 12 hours are the ones that matter." "I'll stay," Kapoor said, not as a question. "I know you will," she said. "That's why this hospital is lucky to have you." He looked at her. "Sarah, what you tonight, all of it." He stopped, ran a hand over his face, tried again. "Are you okay?" It was such a simple question. Such a human question, the kind that cuts through everything operational and everything professional and arrives at the actual person underneath. She thought about it honestly. "Not yet," she said, "but I will be." He nodded. He understood that she meant it. "For what it's worth, he said. Medic 7 or Sarah Jenkins or whoever you need to be tomorrow tonight, You were exactly who this building needed. She held that for a moment. Then she said, "Get some sleep when you can, Kapoor." And she left him to his coffee and his processing and the long necessary work of returning to yourself after a night that has taken you somewhere you didn't plan to go. She found Diane at the charge desk because Diane was always at the charge desk because some people's dedication to their post is so complete, it becomes structural, becomes part of what holds the building up. Diane looked at her. Not the sideways look of 11 years of professional proximity. Directly, fully, the look of a woman who has shared a foxhole with someone and emerged from it knowing them in a way that ordinary coexistence doesn't produce. "You're staying," Diane said. It was not a question. "I'm staying," Sarah confirmed. "Good." Diane looked at her paperwork. "Because the EKG in Bay 6 is going to need that lead replaced properly before day shift. And the portable monitor in Bay 3 has a software conflict I need you to look at, and the defibrillator cartwheel is still sticking." Sarah almost laughed. It came up from somewhere deep, warm, and real, and completely unexpected, and she let it out a small sound, not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it that had relief in it and gratitude and the specific, uncomplicated joy of being known by someone who sees you clearly and asks you to stay anyway. "I'll get to them," Sarah said. "See that you do," Diane said, and went back to her paperwork. The sun came up over the city at 6:12. Sarah was in sub-basement 2 when it happened, which meant she didn't see it, but she felt the quality of the building change around her. The particular shift that happens in hospitals at dawn when the night staff begins to hand things over and the day arrives and the specific collective exhale of an institution that has survived another night moves through the walls like something living. She was at the workbench. The ventilator fan assembly was complete and tested and ready to be reinstalled. The portable monitor's software conflict had been resolved. The defibrillator cartwheel had been disassembled, cleaned, and reseated with a replacement bearing she'd had in stock for 2 months. Her toolkit was closed. Her radio was quiet. On her forearm, Medic 7 was smudged at the edges and entirely stubbornly present. She looked at it one more time. She thought about what it had cost to carry that name, what it had cost to put it down, what it had cost and what it had given her to pick it up again in the middle of the worst night St. Jude's had ever seen with a marker in the shaking hand of a man who had believed in what she was, even when she had stopped believing in it herself. She thought about Director Carver and the folder and the handshake. She thought about Senator Marsh in his hospital gown, unbothered by his own authority. She thought about Decker sleeping. Actually sleeping, not the terrible near absence of before, but the legitimate sleep of a body that had been pulled back from the edge and was now doing the work of returning. She thought about what she had told Kapoor. "Not yet, but I will be." She picked up her toolkit. She picked up her radio. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. And when the doors opened, she stepped into the corridor of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital at 6:18 in the morning, and the building moved around her the way it always had, purposeful, full, the constant, urgent, ordinary business of keeping people alive. And she moved through it with the particular ease of someone who belongs somewhere, not because they have been given permission to belong, but because they have decided. She was Sarah Jenkins. She had always been Sarah Jenkins. She was also Medic 7. She had always been Medic 7. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Both of those things had always been true simultaneously. The 11 years she had spent trying to make one of them disappear had not diminished. The other had not, she understood now, diminished either. They had only made her carry them separately in different hands, never letting them touch. Tonight had put them back together. She passed the nurse's station. She passed Bay 7 empty now. In Bay 2 where the trauma had begun. In Bay 4 where the man with the wrong breathing pattern had been caught in time because she had been watching. She passed Trauma 1 with its doors closed and its monitors reset and its surfaces clean. Diane's team meticulous as always, the visible labor of invisible people restoring order to a room that had held chaos. She went to the supply alcove and she picked up the portable monitor that needed its cable replaced, and she carried it to the workbench she kept in the corridor for quick repairs, and she opened her toolkit and she began. The work was small, the work was specific, the work was the kind that most people walk past without seeing the kind that kept the machinery of care running so that the people trained for the dramatic moments could have those moments when they arrived. She had spent 11 years understanding that this was not lesser work, that the people who maintained the systems were not lesser people, that dignity was not a function of visibility and heroism was not a function of title. She still believed that. She believed it more now, not less, having been seen. Having been both the invisible woman and the one they called to the front, she understood something that the night had clarified with the particular force of things learned through your body rather than your mind. You do not have to be visible to be essential. But when the moment requires you to be seen, being seen does not betray the years you spent in the quiet. It honors them. Every ventilator she had repaired, every floor she had cleaned, every monitor lead she had seated, and every cartwheel she had disassembled, and every name she had not been called while moving through the halls of this building. All of it had been preparation. All of it had been the maintenance of a person, not just a building. Keeping herself functional, calibrated, ready, in the work that asked nothing of her past and required only her present, until the night that required everything. She replaced the cable. The monitor's display came clean and steady. She tested it, green across the board. She clipped her toolkit closed. Down the corridor, she could hear the day shift arriving, the particular sound of fresh voices layering over tired ones of the building, changing hands, and the night releasing its hold on the people who had held everything together inside it. She would give her account to the day-charged nurse. She would check on Decker's vitals through the nursing update system she had legitimate access to. She would respond to Carver's follow-up at an appropriate hour with the conditions she had stated and the decision she had made. She would do all of those things. But first, she would finish her shift. Because Sarah Jenkins had walked into sub-basement 2 at 8 o'clock the previous evening with a job to do, and she had not finished it, and unfinished work was something she did not leave behind her. She picked up the monitor. She carried it back to Bay 3. She positioned it correctly, checked the connection, confirmed the calibration against the central system. Perfect. She stepped back. The monitor ran its steady, reliable, entirely unremarkable signal into the air of the emergency department, doing the thing it was designed to do, holding information that would matter to someone at some hour on some ordinary or extraordinary day in this building that held life the way all such buildings do, imperfectly, stubbornly, without ceasing. Sarah Jenkins looked at it for one moment. Then she picked up her toolkit and moved on to the next thing. The way she always had, the way she always would not, because she had to. Not because no one else could, but because she had decided long ago that this was where she belonged, and because last night, in the middle of fire and chaos and 11 years of buried things rising to the surface, that decision had been tested at its absolute limit and had held. She was the woman nobody saw. She was the woman who saw everything. She was Medic 7, and she was Sarah Jenkins, and she was home. And that was enough. That had always been enough. And now finally everyone knew it.